When you think about Florida and the city of Miami, what are some of the first thoughts that come to mind? Is it the palm trees, the beautiful beaches, the year-round tropical weather, the delicious Latin food, or is it all of the above? Well, in today's video, we're going to be talking about a tale that can be summed up in just one word: betrayal. It's a story of a select group of people that tried to become rich the fast way, namely at the expense of others, even if it meant brutally torturing, murdering, and stealing everything these others had worked so hard to build. And they almost succeeded. They were chasing the American dream but ended up on death row in prison instead. This is the story of the Miami's Sun Gym Gang. In today's video, we are going to be transporting ourselves to the sunny Miami. Miami, year-round tropical weather, beaches, and palm trees. What could be a better place to talk about a serious crime that happened here back in the 90s? It was the year 1994 and John Meese was about to ditch the business he had worked so hard to build, the Sun Gym in Miami, a business that he had toiled for over 7 years. John Meese was an interesting character. He started bodybuilding at Texas's A&M University, where he had earned an accounting degree. In 1962, while stationed in England, he had won the Mr. United Kingdom contest. He also wanted to compete in the Mr. America contest, but the army didn't allow him to compete. While John Meese certainly had the street cred to run a bodybuilding gym, and even had a background in accounting, he wasn't very capable when it came to hiring the personnel to help him run the gym. You see, the Sun Gym wasn't your average gym where you typically see weekend warriors, soccer moms, and guys weighing 130 pounds flinging around 5-pound dumbbells. No, this was a serious gym for serious people, a bodybuilding mecca, one might even say. Most of the people that came to pump iron weren't exactly the creme de la creme of society. Most were actually ex-criminals and other lowlifes. A cop once joked that he could fulfill his entire month's quota in one day by arresting everyone at the gym who happened to be there that day. You see, the gym was losing money, especially after the newly opened Gold Gym in nearby Miami Lakes began siphoning off clients. So John Meese needed to do something. And when Daniel Lugo showed up at his doorstep and asked for a job, he couldn't turn him down. So here's what you need to know about Daniel Lugo. Daniel Lugo was originally from New York but had moved to Miami, Florida about 4 years prior. Lugo was 30 years old. He stood at 6 feet 2, 230 pounds and had a big muscular build. He was your typical hustler, always dreaming of schemes to make money, even if these schemes had resulted in hardships for other people. Daniel Lugo had just served a 15-month sentence for ripping off people who were in desperate need of cash. He basically promised people credit, those people who couldn't afford credit the old-fashioned way, via credit cards or banks, if only they gave him some upfront cash to cover the so-called fees. Once he got the money, he disappeared without ever furnishing the credit he had promised in the first place. All in all, he collected over $70,000 in fees but never gave out any loans. Normally, people like that would not be fit for employment. But John Meese was desperate to turn his struggling business around, so he didn't pay much attention to his new hire's sordid past. After landing a new job, Daniel Lugo recruited his good friend Noel Adrian Doorbal, whom he had met years earlier through a girl that Lugo was working with at a time. He had recently arrived from Trinidad and was working as a cook at a local Mexican restaurant in Miami. Lugo and Doorbal became close training buddies and would go into business ventures together and eventually would be partners in crime as well. When Lugo joined the gym, he was full of ideas. He wanted to take the gym to new levels and was even contemplating creating an entire Sun Gym brand with its own clothing line, vitamins, supplements, and even a karate team. While working as a personal trainer in the gym, Lugo got to know Jorge Delgado. Delgado was born in Havana, Cuba, and knew a certain wealthy businessman called Marc Schiller. Delgado's wife first worked for Schiller and later introduced her husband to the wealthy businessman. Throughout the years, Schiller and Delgado became great friends, and Schiller even trusted Delgado by giving him the security code to his safe. Delgado also knew the layout of the house pretty well, making it super advantageous when you know you just need to rob the place. Plus, he knew where Schiller banked his bank accounts and even the dollar amounts of offshore accounts that Schiller created for his investor clients. And as irony would have it, it was Marc Schiller who had given Delgado a job, and it was ultimately Marc Schiller who would make Delgado famously rich as a result of various partnerships they would go on to have together. But after Delgado joined the gym, he grew closer to Lugo and even began seeing him as some sort of a father figure. Delgado even tried to bring Lugo into some business ventures with Schiller, but Schiller didn't trust Lugo. Something about him rubbed him the wrong way. And as you will soon see, Marc Schiller's intuition would prove to be very, very accurate. And so, as you can see, this isn't about some random to-be kidnapping. They had chosen their target very, very carefully and even had an insider who knew lots of intimate details about the target. And so, under the pretense that Marc Schiller had robbed Delgado of $200,000, Lugo convinced a couple of other guys to join them in executing this master plan of kidnapping, forcing Marc to sign off all his assets to them before ultimately killing him. Fortunately, as you will shortly see, this plan didn't quite happen the way that they had envisioned it. The first thing they did was head over to the spy shop in Miami in order to buy tools needed for the job. They purchased things like taser guns, handcuffs, and even some walkie-talkies to communicate. The owner initially refused to sell them all this stuff, but they made up a story that they were actually security personnel for some rock band. Next, Lugo rented a burgundy Ford van from which they can execute their mission, for spying on Schiller's movements before ultimately nabbing him. And now the time had come to actually go forward with the plan. And their first attempt was a very, very poor one. They wanted to knock on the door to Schiller's house and just grab him right then and there. But as they were about to do it, they changed their mind because a passing car seemed very, very suspicious, and they obviously did not want to have any witnesses walking around and being able to identify them. And so they would go on to try a total of 6 more attempts, all resulting in failure, either because of bad planning, execution, laziness, or most likely a combination of all of the above. Feeling completely down and unmotivated, Lugo regrouped with his team and told them that the next time they would kidnap Schiller come hell or high water. Nothing would stop them now. So one day they stalked Schiller as he was due to meet up with a buyer for his struggling deli. The buyer didn't show, and just as Schiller started walking back to his car, the gang ran out of the van, grabbed and began tasing Schiller. Schiller was shocked and immediately offered his car, money, or anything else to the kidnappers. But without saying a single word, they dragged him into their van. Inside the van, they handcuffed him and began driving in the direction of the warehouse. Over the following days and weeks, the gang endlessly tortured Schiller in all kinds of ways. They also made up a fake story for Schiller to tell his friends, family, and business associates to explain his sudden disappearance. The story went along the lines of Marc Schiller meeting a new woman, falling in love with her, and then abandoning everything that he had worked so hard to build for a new life for them in Mexico. And you know, this is the kind of story that seems to be repeating in a lot of these similar cases where we have a kidnapping under very suspicious circumstances, and then you have the business partner or a family associate that goes ahead and tells the police and everybody involved that, hey, you know, this person just met the love of his life and moved to a country like Mexico. Ultimately, Schiller signed over all his bank accounts, businesses, his house, and even one of his cars over to the kidnappers. And then when there was nothing left to steal, they were going to get Schiller drunk, put him back into his car, and then send that car on a fatal crash so that everything would appear as a suicide. Of course, he didn't know any of this, and so in order to placate Schiller and to tell him that they were going to do something positive for him, they told him that the point of getting him drunk was so that they can smuggle him to Colombia, where his wife was at the time, And because Lugo actually knew somebody working at the airport in the customs section, and they wanted to get Schiller drunk so that Schiller wouldn't be able to identify this person who was working there and then tell them who was the person that was responsible for transferring them to Colombia. Now, Schiller didn't believe this story, but he actually had no choice in the matter at all. And so the day had finally arrived when they needed to finally get rid of Schiller. They put drunk Schiller into his car, and one of the members got into the car as well, gassed the car, and then when the car started to gain speed, jumped out. The car crashed into a pole, but when they drove to the crash site to inspect the situation, they noticed that Schiller was still alive. He was unconscious, but he was still breathing. Then they decided to dose the car with gasoline and set it on fire. But as they were driving away, they noticed Schiller get out of his car and stumble outside. Of course, they needed to kill Schiller, so they decided to run over him. They did it not once, not twice, but 3 times for good measure. After that, they left the crash site thinking that they finally had killed him. But they were dead wrong. Schiller was still alive. Not long after, Gene Rosen, an attorney, called Ed Dubois, a well-known private investigator, and told them that there was a man lying in the hospital who claimed he had been kidnapped, tortured, and then sent to his death. This man was none other than Marc Schiller. Dubois had seen a lot of things in many years of practice, but he didn't believe this. It just seemed too crazy to be real, he thought to himself. Nevertheless, he gave the man some very, very valuable advice: run. He reasoned that just about anyone could walk into a hospital and kill him. He told him to go anywhere, just get out of Miami. And he even offered him to drive to the airport.
Despite his incredible luck, Marcelo Schiller knows the clock is ticking. Once the Sun Gym gang finds out he's still alive, they'll find him and finish the job. And sure enough, Lugo, Doorbal, and Delgado were frantically calling hospitals to see if Schiller had survived.
Jackson Memorial Hospital says, yes, we do have a Marcelo Schiller. He's in intensive care. So they devise a plan. They're going to walk the halls of the intensive care looking for him. And when they find him, 2 of them are going to get into a fight to draw the police officer away. And the 3rd guy is going to go into his room with a pillow and smother him.
I think my fate at that point was sealed, pretty much. They were going to find me and finish the job. I got to the point where I was in panic. Because I can't walk out of there.
So Schiller calls the only person in Miami he knows he can trust, his attorney, Gene Rosen.
It was not your average phone call. He had told me, just in very general terms, about his being kidnapped. I didn't know exactly what kind of shape he was in, but did provide an answer to what was going on. I believed him, of course. Some people didn't, but I did. When I found out that we were dealing with questionable, unsavory characters, I called in Ed Dubois because of his background in the security business in order to help Marc out.
So I told Marc that he should get out of the hospital, go to a safe place. He said he had a sister in Staten Island, New York. This is the plan: get him out of the hospital, get him to his sister's, let him recover. The reason we didn't go to the police department the day that he regained consciousness was the fact that they would send a patrolman out in the hospital to interview Marc Schiller, either that day or the next week. And by that time, the guy would have been dead.
So they decide to airlift Schiller to a New York hospital where he'd be safer.
Meanwhile, the Sun Gym gang was anxiously checking the news to see if the media would cover the car crash. But there was nothing, not even an obituary. Could he still be alive, they wondered. They weren't just sure, but they really needed to be absolutely positive. After Schiller regained consciousness, he told the hospital his real name, and not too long after, the Sun Gym gang found out the hospital where he was staying as a patient. And so the gang devised a plan to find him at the hospital and finally kill him. They visited the hospital but got lost in the maze of walkways, corridors, etc. They even brought hospital garb in order to better blend in, but when they inquired of his status the next day, they were told that he was no longer a patient. By then, Schiller was in New York, where his sister had lived. Leaving the hospital had saved his life. Unable to locate Schiller, the gang calmed down a bit and began enjoying life a bit more. Lugo and Adrian often frequented strip clubs in the Miami area and were eyeing some of the strippers. Lugo even started seriously dating one of the strippers, an immigrant from Romania. Of course, when the women that they were dating asked them what they did for a living, they just made up stuff like they worked for the CIA or another clandestine organization. That would explain the fact that they were living in a multi-million-dollar house in one of Miami's exclusive neighborhoods, at least until the women they were dating didn't start digging deeper. As the gang was enjoying their newfound wealth, Ed Dubois' interest in Marc Schiller's case deepened. He wanted to know more about what had happened so that he could look into it. By then, Marc Schiller was getting ready to leave New York, where he was recovering, and fly to Colombia, where his wife and kids were. So when Dubois asked Schiller to explain to him everything that had happened to him in meticulous detail, he wrote down everything that he could remember about what had happened to him at that time. Soon Schiller realized that everything that he had once owned was now transferred to others. His house, his deli, his offshore accounts totaling over $1.26 million, all of it gone, disappeared into thin air. He told Dubois that Daniel Lugo was involved. While the private investigator didn't know who Daniel Lugo was, he found a familiar name on the notarized documents that authorized the assets transfer: John Meese. Yes, that same John Meese, the owner of Sun Gym, who was also a trained accountant. Apparently, it was him who had signed over all of Schiller's assets to Lugo and Adrian. So when the private investigator Dubois saw John's name there, he couldn't believe it. He couldn't believe that John Meese was somehow involved in the kidnapping. But Schiller assured him that he had to have been involved. Now, Dubois knew John Meese pretty well. They used to even work not too far from each other at some point in their careers. So he couldn't believe that John was somehow involved. He just couldn't believe it. But the signatures were there, and so he set up a meeting with John.
So Marc faxed me the documents, and I was, shocked to find John Meese was a notary on some of the documents and a witness on some of the documents. I knew Johnny, and he had hired me on several occasions to conduct investigations, so he knew what I did. He respected me, and I respected him.
Dubois calls his old acquaintance and presses him for an explanation.
I told him the story, and I showed him the documents where he had notarized the signature of Schiller. And he said, "You've got the wrong picture. This was all a business deal." And he said the two men that he did this for were Dan Lugo and George Delgado. And he believed they would have no problem meeting with me and explaining the whole Marc Schiller situation.
Dubois was still not sure how Meese fit in, but he'd gotten the names of two major players, Lugo and Delgado, and arranged for a meeting with them the next day.
When they met, Dubois showed him the signed documents and studied John's face as he read them. At first, John didn't understand what was happening. He didn't understand where he fit into all of this. But then Dubois pointed out John's signature at the bottom of the document. Now John got very, very confused. Apparently he did sign those documents in the presence of a woman named Diana Schiller, but Diana had left the country on November 18, even though her signature was dated November 23rd. John didn't know how to explain all that. He couldn't really remember the circumstances of how he signed that letter. So Ed told them to set up another meeting and bring Lugo and Delgado this time with him. Now Ed knew that Lugo and Delgado were the ones directly involved with the kidnapping, and so he imagined that they might be a little bit dangerous. Not knowing what to expect, he hired a bodyguard to accompany him to the meeting. And when they met up for the second time, Dubois showed Delgado the signed letter. Delgado looked at it but still had no answer. So Dubois told him that his client wants his money back. Delgado told him that he'd think it over, and then things just kind of got a little bit weird.
Johnny Meese puts his hands up and he says, "Don't even go there, Ed. We're going to give Marc Schiller his $1,260,000 back."
But this reimbursement had one big and very flawed catch.
Meese says there has to be an agreement that you and Schiller are going to be required to sign where you accept the $1,260,000 and never, never, never tell the police department. So I immediately think about that proposal, knowing that is an unenforceable contract. So I said, that's no problem. We will do that.
These knuckleheads were actually negotiating with their former captive to return his money. But after weeks of back and forth BS, the money never shows up. 4 months after the kidnapping, it was time to take their case to the cops.
They initially agreed to give him the money, all of $1.26 million of it. The only thing was that they decided to make it not in dollars, but in actually Italian liras, which was around $1,200 at that time, hoping that that little change on the contract would slip past Marc Schiller and his attorneys. Unfortunately, they really couldn't find a lawyer that would draft such an agreement. And then ultimately, after dragging on this whole thing for days and weeks, and even more weeks, they decided to drop this agreement completely and not give him any of his money back. They did fully abandon Schiller's house, but not before completely emptying it of all of the belongings. For Dubois, the next plan of action was to contact the police. Maybe this time the police would finally take this case seriously and investigate it. So Dubois, a private investigator with many years of experience and who had worked with both the local police and the FBI, contacted one of his acquaintances at the Miami-Dade Homicide Department. Initially, they were very interested in listening to Schiller. They even asked him if he could take a polygraph. But when Schiller flew from Colombia to Miami to take the polygraph, the police started stalling. Apparently, they changed their mind. They weren't really sure anymore. They really didn't believe Schiller. They thought the whole story was just too good to be true. It was too crazy to be true. But then the bad news came. They weren't going to take the case after all.
I've done work for the Miami-Dade Police Department for 25 years at that point as an outside contractor. And they knew me, so I figured I had some credibility. I gave the sergeant assigned to the case all the evidence, my report, all the background investigations that we had done, and he basically had the case with a bow around it on a silver platter.
But even with these damning documents, the case just sounded too outlandish. The kidnapping in broad daylight, the fiery crash, and Schiller somehow survives but doesn't go to the cops for months? As far as the cops were concerned, something about this case was off.
This was a pretty murky kind of case. There were clearly some very bad guys, but they weren't so sure about Schiller because he wasn't coming forward right away, and they were hearing this story so long afterward. I think they approached it with a lot of trepidation.
The boys showed the police all the documents, the contract, and told him, go to the house if you don't believe it. And he goes, this looks like it was just a car accident. I go, what are you talking about, a car accident? These people are saying they stole my money. We have all these documents. To us, it's a car accident and a case of robbery.
I felt the gang were the baddest people I had ever come in contact with, and they're going to probably strike again. The response was, Ed, I think you've been watching too much TV.
The police didn't even look at the money trail. They didn't look at anything. I don't know why. Their view was that this was such an outlandish story, and to think that I'm alive after all that, it's not possible.
The crime had been so implausible and so absurdly cruel that the cops just wouldn't buy it. That freed up Lugo, Doorbal, and the rest of the Sun Gym gang to spend Schiller's stolen money.
This was a huge blow to Schiller and Dubois, especially now that Schiller had flown in to Miami all the way from Colombia. Dubois even contacted the FBI. He knew someone there personally, but even the FBI refused to intervene because they believed the case was straight out of a movie. And so, with the police not really taking any interest in the case, not really going after and investigating this horrendous kidnapping and this theft of all of these assets, things really kind of calmed down for a little bit. And so life continued for the Sun Gym gang. But Lugo, never really happy with what he had stolen so far, wanted to make even more money, wanted to become even more richer and wealthier. And so he had his eye on the next victim. He initially zeroed down on Winston Lee, an immigrant from Jamaica who had worked out at the Sun Gym. While he wasn't as rich as Schiller, he was still rich enough and thus made a good target. Lugo had devised the entire operation. He'd borrow a truck and a uniform and pretend to be a UPS delivery worker delivering a package to Lee's front door. Then they'd nab Lee and transfer him to the warehouse. And then you know the rest. It would be exactly as it was in the previous kidnapping. But then they ran into some issues. While stalking Lee and his movements, they realized that his schedule was just too random. They couldn't accurately predict when he'd be home or at a fixed location, whether that would be at work or his friend's house or anywhere. He was just moving around in a very unpredictable way. Plus, he was constantly traveling to Jamaica, which further complicated everything. Plus, Adrian found an even better target. That new target was Frank Griga, a Hungarian immigrant who had achieved wealth through the phone sex business. He also had a '91 yellow Lamborghini that Adrian wanted so bad. The son of a Hungarian diplomat, Frank Griga was born in 1961 in Berlin and had emigrated to New York City in the mid-80s. He initially worked as a car washer before starting his own businesses. However, he really broke ground when he got into the so-called 900 business. These were phone numbers that people can dial in order to get various information on all kinds of topics. He began with 976 cars, which provided information on used cars, before starting the more profitable 976 sex, where people can dial up and engage in sexually explicit conversations with various actors and actresses. This is where he established his real wealth. He soon began amassing various luxury cars, buying a yacht and a mansion in one of Florida's most exclusive neighborhoods. While Griga had plenty of girlfriends, he preferred strippers. And one woman that would eventually catch his eye was Krisztina, also a Hungarian immigrant and also a stripper. The two later would become inseparable, always hanging out and doing things together. Lugo, always scheming and up to no good, was busy hatching his next kidnapping. The plan was a carbon copy of the previous one. They would both snatch Griga and his girlfriend at their house, tranquilize or tase them, and then move them to the safe house. Lugo would rent another warehouse in a different part of Miami. Now, the way that they would get access to Griga was by pretending that they had a very lucrative investment opportunity. And knowing Griga, he would never pass up on the chance to make even more money and perhaps buy another mansion or two. After hanging out at Doorbal's townhouse apartment, Lugo and Krisztina stayed in the living room while Doorbal and Griga went to the room next door. Moments later, the two of them heard loud noises coming from the other room. It sounded like someone was arguing. Lugo and Krisztina rushed in and found the two men in a vicious fight. Griga's head was smashed above the ear with what looked to be a hard, blunt object. There was blood everywhere. While she was in shock, Doorbal grabbed her in a headlock and began choking her. She was quickly handcuffed and her feet bound with duct tape. Then Doorbal injected her with Rompun, a strong horse tranquilizer. Unfortunately, the plan once again didn't go according to what they had planned. This time they'd overdo it. Griga was dying and Krisztina, while still alive, was on her way to death as well. Now they had one dead body and another one on the way and no plan of disposing the bodies. And moreover, they really hadn't gotten the assets, the bank accounts, the houses and everything that they had planned in the first place. And so the next day they wrapped the bodies, loaded them onto a U-Haul truck and drove them to Lugo's rented warehouse, the same warehouse where they were supposed to torture the victims. At the warehouse, they began cutting up the bodies and removing any kind of identification such as teeth or fingerprints. Back at Griga's house, the housekeeper discovered that it was empty and raised an alarm. She called one of his closest friends who was with them the night they'd been murdered. This friend immediately raised an alarm because prior to Griga and Krisztina meeting with Lugo and Doorbal, they've also spent some time at their mansion, so the friend had immediate suspicion what might have happened. The next day at 7:30 in the morning, Lloyd Alvarez, a friend of Griga, who'd been at the house the night of the disappearance, recognized Griga's yellow Lamborghini. And this was right after he had heard that his friends had disappeared the day before. He sped up and recognized Daniel Lugo behind the wheel. He remembered seeing him at their house the night before. The next morning, Griga's Lamborghini was found by the police 3 miles west of Florida Turnpike. It was abandoned in a desolate wooden area. The doors were open, the windows down, and the key was still in the ignition. Things were suddenly going very, very badly for the Sun Gym gang. Alvarez had seen them on the road, and then all these other people that had seen them at the house the night they disappeared. Not long after, a police detective phoned Ed Dubois and told him of a possible double homicide of a wealthy Miami businessman and his girlfriend. Not soon later, Marc Schiller returned to Miami. This time the police didn't make fun of his story and listened very, very carefully. He told his story to the main detectives, trying to remember every single detail of his horrid ordeal. He provided to them all the names, including Jorge Delgado, Daniel Lugo, whose voice he had recognized during the kidnapping, and also John Meese, whose signature was on the documents that gave away all of his assets to a bunch of random crooks. The next morning at 7 a.m., 75 officers of the Miami-Dade police force were ready to serve search warrants to everyone who was involved. Ultimately, all of them would be arrested and charged with kidnapping, murder, attempted murder, amongst many other charges. The trial began in February 24, 1998. It was the longest and most expensive criminal trial in Dade County history, with the prosecution featuring over 1,200 pieces of physical evidence, including 98 witnesses, including Marc Schiller, whose testimony was especially crucial to the case. On May 4th of the year, Lugo's jury convicted him of 2 murders, as well as 16 other charges, including racketeering, kidnapping, attempted extortion, theft, attempted murder, armed robbery, and a bunch of other charges. It's a really, really long list. Both Lugo and Doorbal received the death penalty. John Meese was convicted on 39 felony counts, including 2 counts of first-degree murder, attempted murder, forgery, and the like. He would be ultimately sentenced to 56 years in prison. When it was all done and over with, Schiller inhaled a breath of fresh air. It was all over, finally. But as soon as Schiller walked out of the courthouse, he was grabbed and taken away. Apparently, Schiller was a wanted man. He'd been a target all along, but the feds wanted him to wait until he finished testifying at the trial before throwing him in jail. He was arrested and charged of orchestrating a fraudulent Medicare billing scheme that generated somewhere around $14 million. He now faced up to 25 years in prison, more than Delgado had received for kidnapping and murder. In July 17, 1998, more than 3 years after the murders were committed, Judge Ferrer sentenced Lugo and Doorbal to death for the murder of Griga and his girlfriend Krisztina. In February of 1999, after Marc Schiller pled guilty to one of the federal counts of false Medicare billing, the judge took the highly unusual step of writing favorable testimony at his sentencing. And on March 17, 1999, Marc Schiller was sentenced to just 46 months in prison, the most lenient sentence available under federal guidelines. The Sun Gym is now closed. And that is the entire story. What a crazy story. Let me know in the comments what you think. Like this video if you enjoyed value from it, and subscribe to the channel if you are interested in more of these true crime stories. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.